Okay, we are recording.
Well, hello. Hi,
Hi.
Alison.
Hi, Milka.
I love your like bookcase Zoom background, which I know
I
is
know. I will confess, I'm sitting at my office mate's desk so that my stuff is in the background rather than somebody else's stuff in the background. And yeah, and I have the Lewitsky poster. I have old ephemera. So yeah, there's a lot going on back there.
it's good. I'm so bad at decorating my office space, home in general, so I'm super impressed by it. Super cute. I think I wanted to start by asking like some really basic questions that are actually like big questions. And I think, there's like a way where we can talk personally and individually about our like work and point of view and what we're doing. But I was thinking maybe starting big. And I think maybe in relationship to the exhibition and just conversations I'm having with different people is like, it's really like two questions, but maybe there's a way to like incorporate both of them. But I was thinking what is Los Angeles? And like what are we talking about when we're talking about dance? And then what is dance in Los Angeles? And why is this a thing? And obviously like we're based in Los Angeles, but just like those like basic ideas, which is a lot, but I feel like it's just something to think about, like because I think it lends itself to like many different ideas. So I don't know.
Yeah, and I already feel myself wanting to like jump in and ask you the questions that I had. I think they're similarly kind of big picture. But I mean, is it okay if I answer that in terms of talking about like how I came into conversation with Jenny about the show at the box? Because around the same time as Jenny, and then ultimately Alana as well, and then got into conversation with Peter in the box, around the same time as all that stuff was happening, I found myself getting drawn into all these questions about Los Angeles dance history. And this actually involves you, because one of the main triggers for this was when there was do you remember when you showed Anthem at that Dance USA conference
At like
evening?
a Bali gallery.
Yes, exactly. So after that show, there was that article in the New York Times that said like the headline was "The Los Angeles dance scene, yes, there is one." And I just like lost my mind because I was like, why is this such a thing? Like, why is it such a thing to always talk about Los Angeles as though, whether it's like emptiness or whether people are like, there's some like rhetoric around like discovery going on. Like, it seems like every time something happens in dance, it's like happening for the first time in Los Angeles. It's really, and of course there's kind of the like, well, from the perspective of New York, and I don't want to get too much into the like New York LA thing, but just this feeling of like, why are we constantly starting? Why are we constantly emerging? Why is LA always the place that was empty until X, Y, or Z happened? And I felt like I had run into that kind of language or that kind of rhetoric a bunch of times since I moved here. I moved here in 2010. Obviously, not only is there, those of us who are, and we should be specific that the show at the box really concerns modern dance history, right? So we should be specific that that's kind of like what we're talking. I mean, I talk about some ballet stuff, but there's that feeling of like, oh, there was Denishon and there was Horton and there was Lewitsky, but also like when I moved here in 2010, there was a ton of stuff going on. And I just started having questions about why we talk about Los Angeles that way. And, um, it became this kind of like allegory almost for the way that dance history operates and invisibilizes in the culture. So, what is Los Angeles? What is dance? I mean, coming back to your question, that I don't know, but I think that is what got me interested in talking about it, was this perpetual kind of way in which we're referring to Los Angeles as though it's emerging or unveiling itself, or somebody just arrived and finally the thing is happening. And in fact, there are all these institutional histories and personal histories that are also tied up in various kinds of invisibilization and erasure and institutional failure and all these kinds of things. So that's a lot of what I think about. That's a lot of what I'm trying to deal with in the piece that I'm presenting. I don't know if any of that stuff resonates for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've been thinking a lot about one basic idea, which is like the difference between like institutionalized history, personal history, and then the erasure that can sometimes come up, especially like with institutional history. And I grew up in Southern California, and I think also there's something about like the idea of Los Angeles, I think, is often expands into Southern California. There's like a way where there's like this like metropolitan kind of way that people go in and out. I don't think like the city proper or even the county proper is like is the only thing to think about. I think it's about like how things like expand out regionally. When I grew up in Long Beach, and having the more sort of like childhood dance experiences that were like recent to Los Angeles. And my experience with it is that like the other kind of like missing important part is like the commercial contribution to dance in relationship to Hollywood. And I think that it's so easy for a kind of like academic lens to be really dismissive of it, because there's often this rejection of the kind of market and capitalism that's like attached to it, and the sort of for-profit idea of it. But then when we look like historically at like some of the most sort of like quote unquote important dance artists in like concert dance, modern dance, or even like American ballet, and even like other, I mean, if we think about like concert jazz, for instance, or like these companies that are really trying to establish a different framing of concert dance, it's so many artists are going between the sort of like commercial world and like the maybe like non-for-profit concert dance world. And I think that there is a lot to be looked at there. And I think in terms of like the codification of like technique, and like the practice of forms and the ways that like people transmit information. And I think that I think the reason why we're always like dismissive of the history in Los Angeles, as well as like always thinking anew, is because it's still within like a more like Eurocentric lens of like a concert dance that's like patron oriented and not like, and I think that as much as like the conversation about like New York is like really old and boring and doesn't go anywhere, I do think that like They're like that like not everything is like has to be seen through a New York lens. Like even that article about, yeah, yes, there is a scene in Los Angeles. Even that article and its framing is like written by the New York Times, you know, and suddenly like you're legit, you know. And I also was like having a conversation with someone, and I have this conversation often, is like this relationship to criticism and how like you know, in New York there's like such a fixation on like the New York Times and being in it and like getting a good review and all that kind of stuff, which also people challenge and fight. And like here we don't really have that. And I think that I kind of think that's okay. I think there's like a way where like I think people feel like in order for things to feel legitimate or anchored is like we need that. But I think like I also just think I'm trying to like go in a direction with this, but like I guess like what I'm trying to say is like there is a kind of freedom in the fact that we're like there's like this underdog, like people think there's not something here that I think is a part of the practice of being an artist in Los Angeles. And I think it also lends itself to a bit of shape-shifting in terms of discipline and context and like where you might place your work and how you might articulate it and like and challenge the like boundary between dance and not dance. So I think there's like a way where like I kind of like that it's that like there's like this way that like there's not an established identity of Los Angeles. And I think it also is because of its, you know, colonial history and like the ways that it's just continually been this place of like renewal, like reinvention, like overtaking, suppressing in a way that I think is still present. You know, it's like so present in like day-to-day life outside of art as well as like within it.
This is pretty much segueing into the big question but first of all, yes, the Hollywood thing, like, yes, I totally did not, when I was so I have this academic research project that's kind of going alongside what I was doing at the box. And when I was doing research for that, I was totally amazed to find out some of the work in film and television that like, I had no idea that Donald McHale came out here to choreograph Bedknobs and Broomsticks. Like, amazing. And no one does talk about that in a certain kind of canonical like dance history. But so yes to that. And then everything else that you're saying is segueing into the big question that I wanted to ask you, which is less to do, I think, with Los Angeles and more to do with the relationship between history and kind of the body and physical practice in general, which is like how, like, what feels important to you in terms of how, like, perpetuation and historical continuity. And I'm talking about you and your specific practice. So you're in Mirror Stage right now, right? So I think you should say a little bit about what that is, because we talked about this at the gallery, but it's just so amazing. And I think part of why it works well is the particular way in which the space is set up is just so perfect for it. But also it's conceptually really interesting in that it's this kind of like pervy, voyeuristic window into a rehearsal room, warm-up room. So I guess this is a two-parter, like, say a little bit about Mirror Stage, and then also, like, you know, you were talking about the kind of pleasure and relief of being under the radar or shape shifting and what Los Angeles gives you in terms of that. Like, what matters to you? Like, do you want your works to be restaged? Do you want your works to be captured well on video? Do you want people to write, is it important to you that criticism and smart writing about your, like, what feels important in the year 2022 about making dance history? Like, how do we want to think about it? What feels important to you? So that's a two-parter.
Oh my gosh. I mean, I think like Mirror Stage is essentially this. I made a dance studio in the Box Gallery where I brought in this modular floor that's like this kind of like very generic industrialized parquet wood dance floor that, I think growing up was like at every like hotel ballroom, event space. I did dance competitions. It was the floor we danced on. I've been to so many wedding receptions and have danced on it. And it's pretty generic, but it's also really specific. And I think my relationship to the floor has a lot to do with my relationship to dance and the different facets of dance it interacts with, and the fact that it is this like social vernacular place for people to dance, as well as this like weird privatized like competition space. And then I've like kind of taken it and put it in this more like arty concert dance, like hyper educated space with Anthem, which is like where I first used it. But also was practical. It was like in relationship to Los Angeles. It was in relationship to, the limited studio spaces we have and performance spaces we have. So I wanted to create like a space that could I could dance that could happen anywhere, and I could just kind of like build it. And so the floor became that like framework. And I think it's like emblematic of like my relationship to Los Angeles. And I love being able to sort of like fit into different situations and make work and not be continually disappointed that I can't get the like beautiful black box theater or proscenium space. And instead I want to be able to like make the kind of work I want to make wherever maybe, or maybe somewhere specific, but not feel so attached to the theater. And I think that like there is something about like practice and labor, which is really important. And I think not trying to separate like end products with that. And I think there are some artists who like have approached that by being like, I'm gonna just do process-based work, and this is what you'll see. And I'm like really blurring this distinction between the performance and a rehearsal or whatever. And for me, like I love a show. Like I'm a show pony.
Yeah.
Like I'm a show pony. But in the show poniness, I want there to be evidence of like the time and labor in the work itself. And I think Mirror Stage is also like a way to visualize. I don't know if visualize is the right word, but it's like to at least like reveal the like kind of more like, behind closed doors, like rehearsal environment that like might exist. And I think especially like in a gallery space or even in the dance world, it's like we have such a focus on end product, or like someone's practice is judged on like where it's performed, how many places it's performed. But it's not necessarily judged on its like development. And I think that Mirror Stage is sort of like, it has this like double or two-way mirror. So like people can veer in the other room. But when you're in here, it really just looks like a mirror. And so you can kind of like get in the zone, like you're in your own private space. So you're not necessarily performing, because there have been instances where people have included spaces that are more public. I remember like Jimmy with Made in LA like had
the gold stage.
And I remember doing that and just feeling like, oh, people just think I'm performing. And even when I'm not. And then it became about that. And this still does that, but I feel like it at least kind of like, there's like a psychological like recalibration and something about it that like makes it feel that way.
Well, it's messed up because you don't know if somebody is looking at you or not. So it, in addition to the potential of you, like essentially like you could be not performing when somebody's looking, or you could be you could be show ponying your warm up and no one's there. You know, you could be like thinking that you're the object of this like gaze when it's not even happening, which is pretty great.
Which is also what we do in rehearsal. Like if we're preparing to perform something, we're doing the kind of like the same thing but inverted, like where we're like having to pretend that people are there so that we can what we're doing. So it definitely plays with that, and I'm interested in that. And then I think that I also just because I there is this interest, my personal interest in this kind of like relationship to like the body and its labor and its virtuosity and its objectification, and I love like hyper objectifying it, amplifying that stuff, like not hiding it, like just like really. And I think there's something about this space that's like the kind of perviness of it is sort of doing that same thing. It's like giving that like, here, look at it, like look at this. It's a little pervy. So you know, my invitation to people to come in and work in this space is really with this idea, like, you know, this is like the offering, and it's kind of not for everybody because you have to really allow yourself to be seen in a specific way. But then, so the second part of the question, or did I get to this?
Like, what feels important to you? I mean, in terms of, I guess you asked like, what is Los Angeles? What is dance? And I'm kind of like, what is like remembering these days? Like, what does it mean to like memorialize anything? How do we want, what do we even care about anymore when we're thinking about how our work, you know, exists?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that like, I have like such a affinity to like like having conversations with like people who've been in LA for a long time and like hearing those stories, you know?
Yeah.
And you know, a lot of times I'm like, oh, everyone should hear this. This is amazing.
Yeah.
The kind of like more oral history. And you know, there have been like attempts where there's like that Southern California dance history database, and you know, there's lots of attempts. So it's like the other thing about this conversation, it's like this isn't the first time that this has been the conversation either, right?
Totally.
And I think for me, the other thing that I'm thinking about is like, I think I came out of like a community of like experimental dance practice that was like really precious about the work, like because it felt like there wasn't enough support, and maybe there's like a fragility around a kind of like experimentation in dance, which I think is really from my days in like downtown New York dance experimental, whatever that means. That I think people are like really guarded in terms of like output outside of the like live moment. And I think that I am feeling this shift where so many like young dancers, like their relationship to dance here is that's a memorialization of dance that's really different. And so like, for instance, like I might've been like more precious about like showing stuff on social media. And now I'm like, you know what? Like, who cares? Like, or what is someone really missing?
Yeah. And I mean, for me, I look at some of the stuff that's happening on, you know, and I'm not even like on a lot of social media, but like, I look at the way like my students, for example, are engaging with platforms like TikTok and Instagram. And I'm like, this is a new medium. Like the way that people are engaging with that frame, with the act of scrolling, with the time constraint, like that is really fascinating to me. And I hadn't thought about that when I asked you that question, but yeah, for sure.
And then not to get too much into that, because I feel like it's like another thing, but I think that there's something in that also changes the way people perform. Not only like what they perform, but like how, like I see this like performative mirror thing where it's like, I'm performing for how I look, you know, and you can kind of see the gaze of the eyes stop at like wherever the like phone is, you know, it's like, that's the performance. It's like how I look. And so we're really good at like the 2D use of space, you know?
Yeah. We're
good at like the right angles. We're good at all that stuff. And doing multiple takes and all of that. But I think like like, I mean, just my personal practice is about expanding notions of what dance is or is not. So I'm, you know, something about being in this space, like I am thinking a little bit like, what are these like physical remnants of like a dance practice? Like this floor has like like a really core relationship to like what I do, but it's not like mine, like in the same way. But it because it is kind of this thing that like everyone shares, and I think dance is the same. And I don't know, I mean, I think like better writing about work is always exciting. And I think that you know, I was just thinking about writing with an R and how you know, I think with the pandemic, like I don't know how much is happening with writing with an R because there weren't shows, you know.
Right.
But I was just thinking about like how I enjoyed this sort of like short format from like 3 voices in relationship to a performance. There's not like a guideline to like the approach in the writing. It's really specific to who's responding, and how exciting that is, because I also think it's reflective of Los Angeles. But you know, like I'm not sure if like, yeah, I mean, I guess I don't know, because you're in this world, but and it's like I am too, which is academia, and it's like I also just question the academic approach to writing about dance, you know, like.
Yeah, I question that for sure. I question majorly the relationship between, like, what are we doing when we're writing about other art? Well, I guess I say other artists because I self-identify as an artist, and I also write critically. And some people who are doing academic writing don't identify that way. But so for me, that raised like, it just feels, yeah, I'm okay. That's a different conversation too. But I have questions about that majorly. And as I continue to develop whatever this writing project is going to be that I hope to keep working on that has to do with Los Angeles, part of what I really want to do is play with, you know, take some approaches that are potentially unexpected to dealing with historical material. Like, I actually don't really identify as a historian, mainly because I don't feel that good at it. I'm not that good at retaining historical facts, but I am interested in the way that we think, you know, like one of the things that I was talking to Jenny about from the very beginning is like, we both found ourselves, in Alana too, I think, obsessively like Googling the addresses that would come up when we would be researching stuff, like, oh, this studio used to be here, like, what is it now, you know? And it's like that, you know, rather than saying, you know, this studio was here from such and such a day, and here are some pictures of it, and here's who was here. It's like, what does it mean then to be like going through this tunnel of like, you know, Google mapping it now, and like, just what is that experience like? So
This, I mean, this is, I don't want to get too in a different direction, but you know, part of this exhibition, I had this idea of creating like a dance map that people could like add
yeah,
to.
yeah,
I kind of pulled away from it because it was such a beast of an idea. Because I think there's a lot of ideas of like people contributing to a map that would be in relationship to like personal history, and that can mean many different things. It could be like, I think part of my idea was like, let's map where we've danced. So that could be like your living room, that could be like a dance studio, it could be at your high school, a party, like whatever it is. But like, think about it in terms of location. But I think like it started to feel complicated in relationship to like cartography and like colonization and like
territorialization, yeah,
and all that stuff. But I also think there's this, but I think there could be an offering, and I'm thinking about it in relationship to present day location and then like time in relationship to that. So when you bring
like more of a geological thing. Yeah,
yeah, and then I was thinking about just in what you were saying is that, you know, I went to Krakow, you know, which is like a really important area in terms of like the Holocaust, because like so many atrocities were committed, and that's like where like Schindler had his factory. And then there's a museum there called the Galicia Museum, which is essentially that like region between Poland and Ukraine of Jews, who, like, many of whom who were killed in the Holocaust. But the concept of this museum was all through present day material. And so it was like talking about the Holocaust through like present day imagery and location and places where people lived, as a way to create more of a present, like to really feel the presence of the Holocaust like now. And not think of it as like, oh, it's in the past, like it's gone. And I found it to be really moving and really smart and like really interesting to like think about like history as something that's like still here, or like how we, because I think especially with like building on things and renovating a building and like tearing it down and like we have this relationship for like, especially in the States. Europe has like dealt with that in lots of different ways. But like, you know, we think about that also in relationship to colonization. But it is interesting thinking about that in terms of Los Angeles, because, you know, in other cities, and especially like New York, things are still around. Like a lot of things are still around because there's like a kind of protection in relationship to the city. And, you know, Los Angeles also has a lot of like political issues and legal issues that don't have the same protections as like other places. So like, you know, even just like the rigor of our rent control is like not very strong. And like I think about you know, like the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council really has this like hand in the kind of like artwork that's being done in a place that was like hyper developed like the financial industry, and like we don't really have that same kind of thing here, which then also makes me think a lot about like the way our civic relationship to the city is sometimes lacking. And I also think it's related to the way that people kind of like dip in and out of the city in a different way, which I think is true of a lot of other places. But I'm thinking more about that, just like having been someone like grew up here, went to college here, and then I went away and I came back. Like, how are we actually connecting like what we're doing to like the like greater idea of the city, and not just like we're here because it's cool. But yeah, we should probably maybe one last thing, and then
let's do it.
This was definitely more than half hour.
I know. No, actually, I mean, we're not doing that bad, but yeah, let's any final thoughts? Or one last, I mean, I was thinking as you were talking about how weird it was to see some of the stuff come out at the box, like the Peter archive, the like wall archive. It was really weird to see, you know, the Peter space kind of remade in the box. And, you know, I was like, you know, there were pictures of Pam, and all of it just felt really visceral. I think all of that has been amplified because of, you know, the 2 years that we've had, and having basically being exiled from our public, not only our public spaces, but, you know, so many dance spaces are gone now that existed before. And it kind of feels like a reboot, you know, in a really weird, traumatizing way, maybe. But I think, I don't know, everyone that I like was sort of chatting with at the gallery was having that feeling of like, oh my God, not only are we seeing each other, and we haven't seen each other in a while, and, you know, some of us haven't seen much live performance, but also then like all these material traces of different spaces were kind of like present again. It has been interesting.
Yeah, I mean, like it's you know, there's something about like all the flyers that were like re-flyered on the wall, on the hallway wall, that like reminds me of like like how sensorial attachment to place, like smell and
Yeah.
feel and sight and texture and all of that stuff. Yeah, and how a lot of that's is has been lost in a certain way. Like, and I also want to say, but also not, like, and I think that's also like this idea of like even what we're saying about like the way history is like still present today, but like I remember having a conversation with an artist um, in New York, because I think New York also has this like history of all these like DIY like artist run things, and then they end,
Right.
and this artist was like, yeah, things should end. Like if it didn't end, like it wouldn't be like what it was. And I always think about that, like I think this idea of I do believe in like an idea of sustainability, but I also think there is sometimes like a course that is run in certain stages of like different ideas or practices or places or whatnot. And I think, I think it makes sense. Like I think the like where Peter is now, like and where it's going makes sense. And I do think it's hard losing places like Pam and also it's like I had my garage studio, which is no longer around, like all these like little things, but there's always an opportunity for like, what else? Like what's new, but I also think it's time for like a more, basically the whole, like the city and the arts funders more accountable in the area. Like, I think that's ultimately like, maybe my stance is like, how do we get buy-in from like people that actually have like help, like can help sustain in a way that's not just like put on the shoulders of like the artists and organizations.
Yeah, those people need to be sustained, not just the spaces. Those people are doing the sustaining, but they also need to be sustained.
Yeah.
I'll share that stance with you.
Yay. Yeah, I'm hoping to be able to like do more of that in the next year.
Yeah.
Like I have more capacity for that. So. Allison,
Let's wrap it up.
Let's wrap it up.